Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to this webinar, the fifth in the ongoing series hosted by ISO Technical Committee 347, Data-Driven Agri-Food Systems. My name is Andres Ferreira, and I'm the chair of TC 347, and I will be your moderator for today's session. The series is designed to explore key technical areas where standardization can support innovation, sustainability, and interoperability in agri-food systems. Today's topic, responsible innovation, what it is, why it matters in standardization, and what ISO TC 347 is doing about it, relates to where shared standards can help connect diverse actors from farmers and researchers to technology providers and policymakers in pursuing an ethical approach to innovation. The topic is complex, though, and evolving, hence the need for discussions like the one we're going to have here today. TC 347 is a new and ambitious committee working to develop international standards that can enable trustworthy, inclusive, and effective use of data across agri-food systems. This webinar is part of our commitment to transparency, engagement, and inclusive participation in the standards development process. Today, we aim to introduce some key insights related to the topic of responsible innovation, highlight how this topic connects to standardization opportunities, and briefly show how you can actively participate in shaping upcoming international standards. Some quick housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded. We will make it available as soon as possible after the webinar. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. We'll address as many as we can during the Q&A segment at the end. And we're very fortunate to be joined today by Dr. James Lowenberg-deBoer, who's going to lead us through the material and the discussion afterward. Let me briefly introduce him. He's the Elizabeth Creek Chair of Agritech Applied Economics at Harper Adams University in the UK. He's also the convener of TC 347's Advisory Group 3 on Responsible Innovation. He has over 30 years of worldwide experience in agricultural research, teaching, outreach, and leadership. His research focuses on the economics of agricultural technology. He's published nearly 100 articles in refereed journals, 2 books, chapters, and 7 other books. He's past president of the International Society of Precision Agriculture and also a former co-editor of the journal Precision Agriculture, which is sort of a flagship journal for the whole discipline. He's a pioneer in the use of spatial regression and analysis of crop sensor data. He's published extensively in this area with work in the US, Argentina, South Africa. He's been very active in research related to, for example, crop storage and related issues in Africa. He was made a Chevalier of the National Order by the government of Burkina Faso for his work in that sense as well. And finally, he got his hands in the dirt literally because he also has a farm in the US. We also have a guest with us that we'll introduce later, Emily LaRosa. So I'll now hand things over to Dr. James Lowenberg-deBoer to begin the presentation. James, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres, and thank you all for joining us today to talk about responsible innovation. And what we'd like to do is to talk about what responsible innovation is, why does it matter for standards, and what ISO TC 347 is doing about it. So if we want to define responsible innovation, I think a good place to start is to remember that responsible innovation has roots in the same debate that led to the precautionary principle, which is very commonly used in Europe. And a statement of that might be, when human activities may lead to morally unacceptable harm that is scientifically plausible but uncertain, action shall be taken to avoid or diminish that harm. Responsible innovation modifies that thought a bit by including the idea of balancing both the positive contributions of a technology and minimizing the negative consequences. For instance, Eastman defined it in 2017 as aiming to guide socially and ethically acceptable innovation. In the standards world, British Standards has a guide to responsible innovation for companies, and it defines responsible innovation as careful consideration of an action to address the potential impacts of introducing a new product, service, process, or business model. If we look into the literature on responsible innovation, there are 5 key dimensions that are usually mentioned, starting with anticipation. And so responsible innovation requires us to identify the impacts of an innovation. And in this case, we're talking about standardization at all scales. So think about what would be the impact on farm, across farming landscapes, throughout the food chain, and considering those rural communities and the general public as well, and considering not just the intended impacts, but also what might be some of those unintended impacts or those disruptive impacts that sometimes technology can bring. Then thinking about, okay, how would the various stakeholders in this process be involved? How would they be affected? Thirdly, to consider the reflexivity of this process, to be aware of our own values and beliefs and assumptions in the standardization process, not only thinking about how our values might differ from some of the other values that other users of those standards might have. And because ISO standards are intended to be worldwide, they need to work in a wide variety of systems. Then responsiveness is taking those insights from the anticipation, from the stakeholders, from reflecting on our own values to mitigate the risk and seize the opportunity, to make those standards as good as they can be with as little negative effects as they can have. And then transparency is to have clear expectations for everyone involved in that standards development process. And it's important to remember that there are at least 2 perspectives on responsible innovation in a standards context. The first one is to consider data standards as a product. So data standards are themselves an innovation. So what should a standards organization consider to innovate agricultural data standards responsibly? But secondly, there's another idea that perhaps data standards can encourage responsible innovation. Can they be worded in a way to encourage those innovators and entrepreneurs to do so responsibly? So, but why does responsible innovation matter for agricultural standards? Well, a simple example might be, imagine African farmers growing watermelons. The promise is that a crop with a story sells better than a totally autonomous commodity. So data standards could be developed to show where a farmer's crop is, how it's developing, something about the environment and how it's produced, and so on. The problem there is that information could give thieves everything they have to know to steal the crop the day before the harvest. So the standards, those kinds of standards, could have a very positive impact, and they could also have some negatives. So we need to think about how to balance those. with another perspective on responsible innovation in technology, I'd like to bring on a guest speaker, Emily LaRosa, a PhD candidate at Michigan State University. Emily, are you there?
I am. Yes. Good morning, everyone, or morning for me, rather. Thank you for joining us. So, in order for us to talk about responsible innovation here, I'd like to first say there's a major problem in the US with responsible innovation and information sharing. And how I've been studying this currently is easiest to think through via the example of the University of California developed tomato harvester. This is a static technology, but a great example to think through how responsible innovation tries to find a balance between the potential good that happens with technology and the possible harm and avoid or mitigate those possible harms. The University of California developed tomato harvester is one of the most cited examples in agricultural ethics because it vividly demonstrates how technological innovation can produce profound and often unintended social consequences. Developed in the mid 20th century by the University of California system researchers, the machine was designed to replace labor intensive manual harvesting of processing tomatoes. This mechanization depended on breeding new, more durable tomato varietals that could withstand the mechanical picking process. The harvester dramatically increased efficiency for large tomato growers. However, labor and social implications were devastating for many small farmers and farm workers. Small farms that could not afford the expensive machinery and the switch to new cultivars were pushed out of the market or forced to sell to larger operations, accelerating the trend towards agricultural consolidation. And the resulting lawsuit by the California Rural Legal Assistance argued that the UC system failed its statutory obligation to serve the interests of small scale farmers, highlighting a legal dimension to this ethical oversight. Now, this leads us into a very likely scenario. The mechanization of tomato harvesting demonstrates that any technological innovation in the field may result in unintended, catastrophic consequences for the most vulnerable farms and affect the bottom line for small to mid-sized farms. We can imagine easily occurring today with autonomous systems deployed in the field. The integration of artificial intelligence, or AI, into agriculture promises improved efficiency, provision, and profitability. But automated harvesting machines such as John Deere's autonomous 9RX tractor, predictive analytics for crop management such as Climate Field View. From all of these systems, AI has transformed the landscape of modern farming. However, this technological evolution raises critical questions about its impact on farm worker justice and sociopolitical implications of neglecting the reality of livelihoods. The UC tomato harvester embodies a classical case of technological determinism, the idea that technological development is the primary driver of social, cultural, and economic change, and that it does so in an inevitable, autonomous way, often independent of human choices or values. The tomato harvester's developers defined agricultural process solely in terms of efficiency, yield, and economic productivity. There was little to no consideration of how the technology would affect smallholder farms. This shows that if innovators treat technology as value neutral, they risk embedding structural harms in the system. This case demonstrates that agricultural research is never ethically neutral. Decisions about what to study and develop inevitably shape social structures and power relations in rural communities. Responsible innovation must not reduce its mandate to technical progress. It demands anticipatory thinking, inclusive stakeholder engagement, and institutional accountability. As agricultural philosopher Paul B. Thompson puts it, technological improvements in agriculture have moral consequences. Neglecting these consequences risks repeating patterns of injustice and marginalization in the name of efficiency. My work attempts to tackle the issue of marginalization of stakeholders and engage them in meaningful ways to ensure that information is shared justly and appropriately. My model, the Curated Information Framework, or CIF, starts from the idea that the more information that we have isn't always better. Instead, what matters to people is to get the right information in the right way at the right time. Many technological systems are so complex that they can look like black boxes to ordinary people, and traditional ideas of full transparency can dump huge amounts of technical data on communities without helping them understand what really matters for their farms, their environment, or their livelihoods. The CIF solves this by tailoring information. It matches what is shared to what people actually need and can use, whether they're farmers, local regulators, or neighbors affected by the systems. In this way, the CIF empowers communities to understand AI systems in context, not just technically, but socially and ecologically as well. The CIF supports responsible innovation by making sure that communities are not just passive recipients of information, but active participants in how information is shaped. Importantly, what can go right or wrong depends on what is conveyed and how it is conveyed. The CIF stands to help regulators and lay communities alike prioritize what they want shared, how they would like said information shared with them, and who they identify as the responsible party for sharing said information correctly. It also allows us to collaboratively identify potential dangers of sharing information before these dangers manifest. It does this through practical steps like local workshops and co-created vocabularies that clarify what a system does, when it might fail, and how it might affect people and the land. This participatory approach builds trust and respect for different kinds of knowledge, scientific, local, and traditional. It also means that farmers' experiences and insights can inform how a system is tested, deployed, and improved over time. By doing this, the CIF recognizes that responsible innovation isn't just about high-tech solutions, but about fair and meaningful collaboration. Finally, the CIF helps ensure that innovation stays responsible after new technologies hit the ground. AI systems evolve and learn in the real world. They don't stay static like a pill or a tractor. That means that we need ongoing ways to check that they are working well and that they don't cause unexpected harm. The CIF works with other good governance ideas like local monitoring, independent audits, and community reporting channels to keep tabs on how systems perform over time. By making sure that everyone involved has clear, understandable updates of information with identified responsible parties, the CIF protects farmers' livelihoods and helps communities shape the future of technology together. Most recently, I had the opportunity to deploy the CIF in the Pacific Northwest US across stakeholders surrounding the use of an autonomous apple picker. We had over 25 participants from 14 different stakeholder groups attend our workshop, developing a shared lexicon and creating their own framework for information sharing. The resulting CIF is a way to hold people responsible and accountable and continuously engage them in information sharing. I'm happy to share more on this experience, and please contact me if you're interested. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. I'm sure there'll be questions and comments at the end of this presentation. But now to think about, okay, you have some idea of what responsible innovation is. You understand how it might affect technology development and standards. What is TC 347 doing about this? The purpose of the Advisory Group on Responsible Innovation, so AG3, is to advise and enable the technical committee to maximize the value and minimize the risks of innovations developed by the committee. And in addition, AG3 will advise the committee and its subgroups on ways to enable support for smallholders and other vulnerable agri-food participants. The scope then is to develop and apply an approach to equip TC 347 with the tools they need to evaluate both new work items and any subsequent work in terms of the key dimensions of responsible innovation, as we've mentioned: anticipation, inclusion, reflexivity, responsiveness, and transparency. And the themes might be things like informed consent, trust, data ethics, increasing usability of standards in developing countries, giving voices to smallholders and including their needs in TC 347 outcomes. And in performing these duties within TC 347, they'll also work with other ISO groups: ISO Committee to Support Developing Countries, the Smart Farming Coordination Committee, and other committees. Metrics that we've come up with for 2025 start with developing an initial set of guidelines for TC 347 for responsible innovation of standards. And that would include both the standards development process, so standards as a product that's being innovated, and how standards can encourage responsible innovation by users. We will also develop at least 5 examples to show how data standards can positively or negatively affect the development of data-driven agriculture and share them with TC 347 members with an intention of helping them better understand how responsible innovation can be effective. And then to do at least one prototype impact anticipation assessment for a proposed TC 347 agricultural standard. The work plan follows the metrics, so developing a short set of guidelines, so 1 or 2 pages. Develop those case studies for standards in data-driven agriculture, and with particular attention to less structured companies. So we feel like the roadmap for structured companies is well laid out in the standards, for instance, in the British Standards Guide to Responsible Innovation. But for companies that don't have ethics committees and are not particularly well structured for this kind of reflection, there's a need for input. This might include entrepreneurs, startup companies, family businesses where the patriarch or matriarch control the business without much input from other parts of the business, and informal sector businesses. And then thirdly, to follow the steps of those guidelines that we've developed, to do an initial assessment and anticipate how the consequences of the proposed agricultural standards would affect all scales in the agri-food system. So on the farm, through the farm landscape, throughout the food chain, in rural communities, and the general public. Going through a process which starts with a thought exercise on how to anticipate impact, developing a prototype framework, and then using that RI framework to do that anticipation. So how do we put this into effect? How do we make this concrete? And after looking through the literature and thinking about what can we do that's most practical and most useful to TC 347, we think that we can use the concept of moral imagination. So what is moral imagination? Patricia Warhead defines it as the ability in particular circumstances to discover and evaluate possibilities not merely determined by the circumstances or limited by its operative mental models or merely framed by a set of rules or rule-governed concerns. Developing ability to envision and evaluate new mental models that create new possibilities and the capability to reframe the dilemma and create new solutions in ways that are novel, economically viable, and morally justifiable. But why moral imagination? So, okay, we looked at the literature, and we recognize that it's important for whatever we choose to be both explainable, because the committee members need to understand how this process works, but to integrate aspects that are present and highlighted throughout the literature. And we might start with a paper by Renia on heuristics for responsible innovation in 2023. And that's very complete, but pretty hard for a non-specialist to follow. We can also look at something like the 4 questions outlined by Doug Constance, also in 2023, which are much easier to understand, but very focused from a particularly perspective on agriculture and values and ethics. And so we also looked at Wharton's idea of moral imagination, and we thought, okay, that might be easier for a broader group of people to understand, and it could be used to integrate aspects from other parts of the literature, from Urenia and Constance and others. In that process, we need to think about what exactly moral imagination is. And so, is responsible innovation more than a rephrased safety protocol? Most companies and businesses do some sort of safety planning. And so is it really more than that? How does responsible innovation go beyond cost-benefit analysis? You're trying to benefit the good and the negatives and the positives. How does it go beyond that? Is responsible innovation another way to say the ends justify the means? If the technology effect is good enough, does it justify getting there? Can moral imagination help identify potential technology impacts, especially those disruptive impacts? And the idea there is by looking at moral and ethical systems, we can identify some of the things that people find important, and then we can think about more clearly how the technology would affect those aspects that people are finding particularly important. And then how can engaging a wide range of stakeholders enable better technology impact assessment? Certainly we all come at this with our own perspective, and the hope is that a range of perspectives can make that process more complete. So the guidelines that we came up with, and they're draft at this point, and we certainly appreciate any comments and edits to this, starts with the 5 key dimensions of responsible innovation, which I've mentioned now several times: anticipation, inclusion, equity, reflexivity, and responsiveness. Create scenarios using moral imagination. Think about what people particularly ethical and moral value on and how the technology would affect that. Identify the implications of that innovation. Think through, okay, not just in the immediate future, but in a decade or 2 decades, what would be the result of this kind of technology? Engaging with stakeholders across the range of the agri-food system regarding the description and classification of those implications. Consider changes that were suggested by interactions by the stakeholders. If stakeholders identify a particularly good effect or a particularly negative effect and suggested changes, consider how they might be incorporated. And then, are there practical ways in which the standard or other innovation can be modified to encourage moral and ethical principles to be upheld? You know, and not just is the innovation itself responsible, but can the innovation encourage responsible activity? And then propose those changes to the targeted standardization document to respond to opportunities and problems identified. So with that, I hope you have an idea of what responsible innovation is, why it matters for standardization, and what AG3 is doing on it. Now I'll hand over to Andres, and he'll tell you how you might participate.
Thank you, James. An important purpose of this webinar series is to give you a glimpse of the different things that are going on in TC 347 and hopefully get you excited about participating, to help you find yourself within the large scope of the committee and to get you participating. So let me tell you a little bit about how that works. First of all, most of the work happens online. We do have 2 big meetings, 2 plenary meetings per year where we try to bring together the whole membership, which is now numbering in the low hundreds of experts. We have a virtual one, so over Zoom, in early October. That's coming up. And then we have an in-person one with some hybrid participation. In March, the first one we had was in Berlin. March of this year, the next one will probably also be in Germany next year. Most of the work happens actually in working groups, ad hoc groups, and advisory groups. These smaller teams that deal with topics like responsible innovation. They meet more often, but it's at their own schedule, and those meetings are virtual. There's two ways of contributing. One is through your national standards body. That will allow you to participate directly in work and help your national standards body come up with its vote on the different initiatives that are put forward by the technical committee, like standards that are being proposed, or new liaisons or representatives to other organizations. A second way of doing it, especially if your country isn't a member of TC 347, we have, as of today, we have 47 member countries, but if you're from another one, what do? Well, we have liaison organizations like the International Society of Precision Agriculture, or Ag Gateway, or the Agricultural Industry Electronics Foundation. We have 10 liaison organizations. If you're a member of one of those organizations, they can allocate you to our committee as a liaison representative. Okay? And we have other mechanisms as well. So if you're interested, please let us know. You will be directed to a survey when we're done here that, among other things, will ask you if you're interested in participating. Regardless, please contact us. We have an email address that you can reach, or just email me or our committee manager, Sophie. We have a LinkedIn page that will give you a way to see what we're working with, and the topics that we're interested in. And finally, there's our main ISO page. And with that, I would like to thank our speakers for a great presentation. I would like to thank the attendees in advance for the interesting questions that they'll no doubt be sharing with us over the next few minutes. So with that, let's move over to our questions. The first one that we have is in the Q&A. It's from Ben Kraker. And he says this is a question perhaps more oriented towards the University of California picker example and not as relevant to the overall topic. I disagree. Actually, I love this question. But I'm curious about the apple example. That industry seems to be following the tomato example from my high-level experience with big orchards, switching to high-density planting to enable easier autonomous picking. So the whole agricultural system is changing, right? Was a solution found to mitigate impact, right? And who are the stakeholders that are typically missing in these sorts of conversations, and how can things change by bringing other people to the table? Emily, you started answering this. I send it back to you for some commentary.
I did, yes. Thank you, Andres. So solutions to mitigate impacts on smallholder farms are still being investigated, and autonomous apple pickers currently are not widely used in commercial farms at this stage. They're still being developed in a broadly in a broader sense in order to be more broadly deployed. And so you're right. There are high density orchards that are being planted in anticipation of this, but at present, this is something that will come to fruition, as it were, and has not yet. And so doing something like the CIF, deploying the curated information framework, allows us to bring in stakeholders and people who aren't traditionally represented in agriculture necessarily, or agricultural technology development necessarily, including indigenous communities, including neighboring farms that aren't necessarily directly impacted by these technologies, but do have drift and We also it allows for folks who are developing the technology to be able to have conversation for the first time potentially with farmers directly. And so that's one of the ways that we can help mitigate the negative impacts of technologies is to make sure that technologists themselves actually get in front of the people whose lives are going to be impacted.
And in some cases, that can be the farmers themselves, right? Because say if the opportunity for picking apples disappears, then maybe those pickers move elsewhere to make up for their lost income. And maybe those were the same people that were picking other crops that don't have a mechanized alternative, right? So
Absolutely. So this is actually something that I call the cascade failure event within agriculture. And what ends up happening is imagine that we have an H2A worker in the United States who specializes in pruning apple trees, picking apples, and they're also responsible for picking blueberries and hops. Now, if a quarter or a third of their income is lost because they can no longer pick apples, they're going to move somewhere else, and that's going to leave the field fallow for other crops, such as those blueberries and hops that they're responsible for.
so one farmer doing something might impact many other farmers, or may even impact them if they have other crops.
Absolutely.
Yeah. James, we had a question when during the registration phase, one of the registrants asked, well, how can this idea of responsible innovation actually help smallholders? Do you have some thoughts about how this approach that that we're working on can make a difference in practice for smallholders?
Yes. So a lot of agri-tech in general and precision agriculture in particular was originally developed for large-scale agriculture. So making use of those same ideas and those same scientific contexts in a smallholder environment is a challenge because it means rethinking how they're implied and applied, and the standardization comes into that process and greatly affects, for instance, interoperability and so on. And to give a specific example, so in Africa, there are a number of research organizations and entrepreneurs who are developing apps for farmers to use to identify plant diseases or pests. And often those, and this is particularly true of the entrepreneurs are thinking about their local environment and the languages that their customers use and how their customers think about these problems. And they may achieve some local success in doing that, but if they want to broaden their market and maybe go to the neighboring country, it doesn't work because people are speaking a different language. They're thinking about things in somewhat different way, may have somewhat different production systems. And those standards can also lead to those those apps can also lead to problems in the sense that, for instance, many of them depend on crowd sharing, information sharing to identify outbreaks. But that information can also then be misused by for marketing purposes or for other nefarious goals. So there's an important ways that and responsible innovation standards can interact with that development process to make them both more effective in achieving the societal goals of prosperity and food security and environmental protection, but also protect the farmers and the businesses that are involved in and the consumers involved in the agri-food chain.
Thank you. Following up on the AI aspect that you mentioned, right? These AI and machine learning based tools that are a very promising way of extending the reach of agronomists and advisors to be able to provide services in places where the human capital mediated extension system just doesn't work because there's too many growers and not enough experts. The topic of AI biases, I think, is interesting, and that was another question that was asked in the registration phase. Emily, for example, large language models or even machine learning models that deal with people often have built-in biases, and those biases can affect the outcome of the model's function. What do you think that responsible innovation can do there? How do these two things intersect? What can we do to make that situation better?
Sure. So there are 2 points first that I'd like to hit. One is that bias isn't always necessarily a negative. I think that especially within ML and machine learning and deep learning, when we're doing programming, we talk about biases, but to the computer scientist or to the person who's developing AI, they might not necessarily hear that as a negative word, because bias just means that it's the decision tree is making a choice between two different nodes. And so that ultimately is one of the questions. And one of the things that we need to hit on when we talk to technologists is to remember that our language might be different. And to remember that when we're talking about these things, we need to elucidate, okay, no, when I talk about biases, I'm really talking about the social implication. I'm talking about the negative structure. And so that's something that we need to remember when we're working with ISO and when we're working with technologists directly. The second thing that I would say is we need to evaluate what data is being put into the system. We need to evaluate who is being solicited for that information and what kinds of historical data are being used to structure either the LLM or the large language learning model or any kind of ML. Because it ultimately boils down to GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. And so if we don't have the appropriate data, if we don't have the appropriate historical data, and if we don't have the appropriate representation within that data, you're going to see malaligned communities continue to be malaligned and continue to have that systemic oppression.
We have one of our participants, Per Frankelius, just shared a link to an interesting article on the topic of the standardization of innovation. And it's an open access journal, so folks, please take a look at that. And thank you, Emily. That's a very, very good set of points, especially that what do we mean by biases? That's great. We have another comment from Einar aimed at large enterprises, right, who are also stakeholders in the ISO system and who are also part of the population that technical committees like ours seek to serve. In this case, what Einar says is, with responsible innovation, I hope that it can make it easier for larger companies to support disruptive and innovative new businesses. I'll make a really quick intro to or first cut at an answer there, and then maybe pass it on to James and Emily. You know, as the world becomes more connected, and there's and farmers have to deal with a multitude of constraints, whether they come from the regulatory framework that they're in or conditions that they agree to with their trading partners or what have you. The time when people would just go and apply a product, for example, on a field without paying a lot of attention to the label and the complexity that's in there, is gone. And the time when companies themselves, especially the big input manufacturers and equipment manufacturers, could sort of ignore what the client was doing with the product, that has also passed, because, say, getting an active ingredient into waterways because the product isn't used properly can lead to, for example, being unable to use the product anymore because its registration might be canceled, or it might become ineffective because, say, resistance to it develops among the target organisms. So providing the large companies that manufacture products or equipment with a framework that they can use as part of their doing business to try to imagine possible unintended consequences and bad outcomes seems to be like a valuable thing. James, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think this is an important point that Einar is making, and I think that major agribusiness companies, in many ways, are missing a tremendous opportunity, both for economic success as well as to contribute to overall societal well-being, in the sense that there are millions and millions and millions of small farmers out there, but in many cases, those companies have business models that are focused on large, well-capitalized operators in a few countries. And so there's an idea out there, there's a book called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, meaning that, yes, those individual small farmers don't have much, but altogether, they're an incredibly large market. And so if responsible innovation can help those companies think about their science and their technology in different ways to reach out to a new set of customers, that's a tremendous opportunity for them and a major positive. The book itself is focused on consumer markets, but the same principle applies to agriculture, and there's many good examples in agriculture. My own work in grain storage in Africa and South Asia tells me that it's exactly that way. And there's many companies who thanked us for that work because it showed them there was a new market that they weren't tapping into.
Mm-hmm. Also, we have a question from Yamada-san in the Q&A, asking how AG3's work will sort of manifest itself. Will the main activities of AG3 be reviews of projects in TC 347 from the viewpoint of responsible innovation, or is it more like a tool-making role? But how do you see this change?
I think the main output is the tool, is something that will, go on being used beyond the current life of the committee. We need to do some assessments just to show how the tool should be used and provide some guidelines, and I'm sure we'll learn things in the process of doing those assessments that help us fine-tune that tool. But to me, the tool is the key output.
So we can imagine that this framework, this toolkit, will have a process of successive refinement, right? Put out a first version, then help our ad hoc groups and working groups use it and learn from that and make new versions, wash, rinse, repeat. Okay.
Exactly.
Are there any other questions? If not, James, Emily, any ideas that you would like to, any final ideas you'd like to add based on the questions and what we spoke here today? Any new insights you'd like to share?
I would like to encourage anyone who's interested in the topic of responsible innovation in standards to, to join us. We need all the help we can get, and as we've pointed out, having more people and more perspectives involved in this process will make it better.
Thank you. Emily?
As a philosopher in the room, I would second that.
Excellent. Let's see, any final comments we have there? Jam's talk is very insightful from Hafiz in Pakistan. It's great to have you here, Hafiz. We need to get you into this committee. And with that, folks, again, many thanks to our speakers for their insights and for bringing up an important topic that we usually don't talk about in the international standardization arena. Recently, Joint Technical Committee 1, Subcommittee 42 on AI, produced a document about basically responsible innovation in artificial intelligence. And what they produced there is so similar to our framework of responsible innovation that I've been secretly, telling myself that we were doing it before it was cool, right? Before the AI folks got to it. So with that, thanks again. Have a great rest of your day, and we will email you soon with more material. And please take a moment to answer our survey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andres.